It started as many great political scandals do, not with a bombshell, but with a whisper. A routine burglary. A quiet summer night in Washington, D.C. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. They wore suits, rubber gloves, and carried wiretapping devices. At first glance, it seemed like a petty crime. But behind those locked doors, a presidency had already begun to unravel. The break-in barely made the front page. Burglary was common in D.C. The suspects didn't talk. There was little fanfare. But 2 reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were suspicious. The men had strange connections. Some were ex-CIA, others had ties to a clandestine group known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. What were political operatives doing breaking into a rival campaign's headquarters? As Woodward and Bernstein began digging, they uncovered a trail of deceit, money, and manipulation. What they didn't know, and what the public wouldn't fully grasp until much later, was that the Watergate break-in was merely the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lay a vast and sophisticated apparatus of political espionage, sabotage, surveillance, and cover-up, orchestrated from within the highest levels of the White House. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 and again in 1972, was a man obsessed with control. Paranoid about leaks, fixated on enemies, and determined to crush opposition at any cost. He didn't invent political hardball, but he perfected it. And as the Vietnam War fractured the country and protests mounted across the nation, Nixon and his inner circle began to operate under a logic that would define Watergate. If we don't break the law, we may lose. If we do, we might win. In this mindset, ethics became optional. The ends justified the means. And the system, as flawed as it was, could be manipulated so long as no one got caught. The White House formed secret units like the plumbers tasked with stopping leaks and gathering intelligence. These weren't political aides. They were former FBI, CIA, and military men operating under executive cover. They broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. Ellsberg had leaked the Pentagon Papers, and they discussed firebombing think tanks perceived as hostile. The line between national security and political revenge began to blur. But perhaps the most chilling element wasn't what Nixon ordered, it was what he enabled. His inner circle, especially men like H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell, believed they were untouchable, that their actions, no matter how legally dubious, were protected by loyalty, secrecy, and power. Money flowed freely through secret channels. Campaign contributions, sometimes in cash, were funneled into slush funds used for dirty tricks. Political enemies were audited, harassed, and defamed. The Justice Department, FBI, and CIA were leaned on for favors. The press was targeted. The public misled. Still, none of it might have unraveled if not for one crucial fact: Nixon recorded everything. Inside the Oval Office, a taping system had been installed secretly. Every meeting, every conversation, every decision was captured on reel-to-reel tape. Nixon believed the recordings would be his legacy, his proof that he'd led wisely. Instead, they became a smoking gun. As the investigations progressed, first by journalists, then by a Senate committee, and finally by a special prosecutor, the White House strategy shifted from denial to deflection. Nixon declared, "I am not a crook." But behind the scenes, the cover-up deepened. Witnesses were pressured. Testimony was coordinated. Lies were told to the American people and to Congress. And yet the tapes remained locked away, incriminating and ultimately inescapable. The walls were closing in. By the fall of 1972, the Nixon administration was facing a slow-moving political earthquake. The 5 burglars arrested at the Watergate complex had been tried and convicted, but only on minor charges. What the public still didn't know, what even many within the government didn't realize, was that the rot went much deeper. And Nixon's most dangerous enemy was not the Democratic Party or even the press. It was the system itself when awakened. 2 months after the break-in, Nixon won re-election in a landslide. His victory was absolute, dominating the Electoral College and crushing his opponent, George McGovern. To the public eye, the scandal had barely scratched him. But underneath that veneer of power, cracks were forming. The Watergate burglars had remained silent, but one of them, James McCord, eventually broke. In a letter to Judge John Sirica, he confessed that perjury had occurred during the trial, and that higher-ups in the Nixon campaign were involved in the operation. The cover-up was beginning to unravel. Congress responded by launching a Senate Watergate committee. Led by Senator Sam Ervin, it became one of the most high-profile congressional investigations in American history. Televised hearings brought the scandal into living rooms across the country. Millions watched as former White House counsel John Dean testified that there had been a cancer on the presidency. He detailed how Nixon had been directly involved in efforts to obstruct justice, suppress evidence, and pay off the burglars. But Dean's credibility was challenged. His testimony alone wasn't enough. What investigators needed was physical proof. That moment came unexpectedly. In July 1973, under questioning by Senate staffers, White House aide Alexander Butterfield casually revealed the existence of a secret Oval Office taping system. It was a moment of breathtaking significance, proof that everything said in the president's office had been recorded. Suddenly, the scandal turned into a battle for the tapes. Nixon refused to release them, citing executive privilege and national security, but the demand was clear. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, appointed to oversee the Watergate investigation, issued a subpoena. Nixon responded by ordering the Attorney General to fire Cox. The Attorney General and his deputy both refused and resigned. It fell to Solicitor General Robert Bork to carry out the president's order. Cox was fired. The night became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. It triggered a constitutional crisis, and Nixon's approval ratings plummeted. In the eyes of the public, the president had now become the aggressor, dismissing those investigating him, tearing at the foundations of justice. Facing massive backlash, Nixon appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. But the pressure didn't abate. Jaworski also demanded the tapes. Nixon stalled, offering transcripts instead, edited, redacted, and full of expletive deleted notations. But the courts were unrelenting. The legal fight culminated in United States v. Nixon, a landmark case argued before the Supreme Court in July 1974. In a unanimous 8-0 decision, the court ruled that Nixon had to surrender the tapes. Executive privilege, it said, could not be used to obstruct justice. When the tapes were finally released, one stood out. Recorded just 6 days after the break-in, the smoking gun tape captured Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, discussing a plan to use the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. It was clear, unequivocal obstruction of justice. The political cover was gone. The House Judiciary Committee had already begun impeachment proceedings. 3 articles were passed: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Republican support for Nixon collapsed. Even staunch defenders in the Senate could no longer ignore the facts. Barry Goldwater, once a Nixon ally, told the president that he had lost the votes. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon became the first American president to resign from office. But the resignation in many ways was not the end. It was the beginning of a long reckoning. Because for all that was revealed about criminal cover-ups, the abuse of federal agencies, and the corrosive effects of unchecked power, there were still many questions that remained unanswered. What exactly had the Plumbers Unit done beyond Watergate? Were there more illegal operations left unexamined? What role did the CIA play in domestic surveillance at the time? And perhaps most controversially, did the full scope of Nixon's activities ever truly reach the public? What they didn't tell you is that much of the scandal was ultimately contained within carefully drawn legal and political boundaries. Nixon was pardoned just 1 month later by President Gerald Ford, a move that sparked outrage, but in Ford's words, was intended to heal the nation. The pardon ended any chance of a full criminal trial. It also sealed many records. Some tapes were lost or erased. Others remained classified for decades. By the time Richard Nixon boarded the helicopter and waved a final farewell from the south lawn of the White House, the official narrative had already been set in motion. The Watergate scandal was as the public was told the story of a single break-in, a cover-up, and a fall from grace. A tragic chapter of presidential overreach, but also a testament to the resilience of American democracy. But this story, the one passed down through textbooks and commemorated in museum plaques, was at best incomplete. What they didn't tell you was that the break-in at the Watergate complex was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader architecture of political sabotage and domestic intelligence operations, many of which remain underdocumented or deliberately buried. The plumbers, as they were called, had been formed well before Watergate initially to stop leaks like the Pentagon Papers. But their activities quickly expanded beyond national security concerns. This group, which operated out of the Executive Office building, included former CIA officers, veterans of clandestine wars, and political loyalists. Their job was to gather intelligence, destroy reputations, and undermine anyone perceived as a threat to Nixon. That included journalists, political opponents, and even members of his own administration. Among the operations they planned was the break-in at the office of Dr. Lewis Fielding, the psychiatrist treating Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg. The goal: find damaging personal information to discredit Ellsberg in court. The burglary was botched, but the intent was clear. And though it was discovered later, it revealed a pattern, one of using government power for personal political retaliation. The enemies list compiled by White House aides was longer than most Americans realized. It included prominent journalists like Daniel Shaw and executives at media outlets like CBS and the New York Times. It even contained politicians from both parties. Many of these individuals were subject to IRS audits, FBI monitoring, and other forms of harassment. One of the most disturbing revelations came years later, when documents showed that Nixon had proposed using the CIA to discredit anti-war activists, infiltrate student movements, and suppress dissent. These proposals blurred the lines between foreign intelligence and domestic law enforcement lines that had supposedly been drawn after earlier abuses in the 1950s and 60s. It raised a chilling question: to what extent had the intelligence community been weaponized for political gain? The FBI, then under Acting Director L. Patrick Gray, was also compromised. Gray admitted to destroying files taken from the safe of Watergate conspirator Howard Hunt. Some of those documents allegedly related to earlier CIA operations, including connections to anti-Castro activities and possibly even plots dating back to the Kennedy era. Which brings us to another unspoken layer of the Watergate scandal: the legacy of Cold War paranoia. Many of the players involved in Watergate were veterans of the intelligence world. E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, for example, had worked extensively in covert operations. Their worldview was shaped not by the Constitution, but by the rules of espionage. Nixon's administration inherited the tools of the Cold War covert funding, blackmail, psychological operations, and applied them to domestic politics. The implications of that shift cannot be overstated. This wasn't just about political ambition. It was about redefining the role of government power in an era of fear. To Nixon and his inner circle, dissent was dangerous. Protesters weren't exercising rights, they were threats to national stability. Journalists weren't watchdogs, they were liabilities. In this mindset, extraordinary measures became justifiable, and some of those measures remain obscured. To this day, not all of the tapes recorded in the Nixon White House have been released. Some have been accidentally erased, most famously the 18.5-minute gap in a conversation between Nixon and Haldeman shortly after the break-in. The White House claimed it was the result of a secretary's mistake, but audio experts questioned that explanation. What was said during that time remains one of Watergate's greatest unknowns. Even beyond the tapes, questions linger about the scope of surveillance employed. Did the White House use NSA resources to spy on domestic targets? Were CIA operatives embedded in operations that technically violated the agency's charter? What was the role of military intelligence? Some historians believe that the full extent of Nixon-era abuses may never be known because too many institutions were complicit, either directly or through silence. Federal agencies, the corporate press, and even members of Congress may have opted not to dig too deeply. After all, exposing the full truth would have shaken not just a presidency, but the very foundations of American power. In the years following, Nixon's resignation attempts were made to rein in executive overreach. The Church Committee, formed in 1975, investigated intelligence abuses by the CIA, NSA, and FBI. It revealed illegal spying on civil rights leaders, journalists, and activists. These findings were explosive but often overshadowed by the singular focus on Nixon. Reforms were introduced, including the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA Court. But many of these reforms would be eroded in the decades that followed, most notably after 9/11, when the logic of national security first returned with new urgency. What they didn't tell you is that Watergate wasn't a one-time failure. It was a blueprint, a demonstration of how far political power could go if left unchecked. A case study in plausible deniability, managed information, and institutional self-preservation. When the dust settled after Nixon's resignation, the American public was offered a narrative of triumph. The system worked. The Constitution held. Checks and balances prevailed. But beneath the celebrations and solemn reflections, a quieter truth remained, one that cast a longer shadow than anyone at the time was willing to acknowledge. Watergate didn't just end a presidency. It redefined the relationship between power and accountability in America. And the legacy it left behind was far more complex than the official story let on. The immediate aftermath of the scandal saw an unprecedented surge in institutional reform. Congress passed new campaign finance laws, strengthened ethics guidelines, and pushed for greater transparency in government. The FBI, CIA, and NSA came under increased scrutiny, and investigative journalism was hailed as democracy's last line of defense. The Church and Pike committees peeled back layers of secrecy, revealing abuses that had nothing to do with Watergate, but everything to do with unchecked executive authority. But these reforms were never absolute. Many were compromised. Others were rolled back quietly in the years that followed. And some, like the campaign finance reforms, were ultimately gutted by court decisions and political maneuvering. Watergate had exposed a dark truth that in times of perceived crisis, even a democracy can drift toward authoritarian tactics, and not everyone is eager to look too closely when it happens. The very idea of national security became a convenient veil, one that allowed both political parties to justify surveillance secrecy and manipulation of public perception. When Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981, he brought with him a different political style, charismatic, confident, and seemingly transparent. But behind the scenes, the shadow of Watergate still lingered. During the Iran-Contra affair, the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran and used the proceeds to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, despite a congressional ban. It was a covert operation run out of the National Security Council without congressional oversight. When it was exposed, many wondered, had we learned nothing from Watergate? The echoes didn't stop there. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton faced his own scandal involving perjury, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power, though of a more personal nature. The impeachment debate revived old Watergate-era questions. What constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors? How far should congressional oversight go? Can a president be held accountable without tearing the country apart? And then came 9/11. In the wake of the attacks, the executive branch claimed powers that even Nixon never dared to reach for. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance dramatically. Secret courts approved sweeping data collection programs. The NSA's reach went global and domestic. Journalists who exposed these programs, like those involved in reporting on Edward Snowden's revelations, were threatened with prosecution. And once again, national security was used to justify secrecy. Some saw this as the fulfillment of the post-Watergate blueprint, not restraint, but adaptation. Government secrecy had simply evolved. It was now embedded in algorithms, cloud servers, and digital surveillance. The press was no longer a singular respected institution, but a fragmented, polarized arena of competing truths. And as social media platforms replaced traditional gatekeepers, disinformation became more powerful than information itself. In this environment, the lessons of Watergate were harder to apply. The idea that a single scandal could topple a presidency seemed almost quaint. Political tribalism had deepened. Investigations were no longer about truth, they were about which side you were on. Accusations of witch hunts and fake news replaced hard evidence. And the public, inundated by an endless stream of scandals and counter-scandals, began to tune out. What they didn't tell you is that Watergate was never just about Nixon. It was about the fragility of truth in a system designed to obscure it. It was about how far people in power will go to protect themselves, not just through action, but through silence, delay, and distraction. It was about the quiet complicity of those who knew, but said nothing, of institutions that bent under pressure, and of a public that sometimes preferred not to know. It was about a question that remains unanswered. When faced with the full truth, will the system choose justice or preservation? Today, many of the players are gone. Nixon is remembered by some as a tragic figure, by others as a criminal who escaped justice. But the deeper structures that allowed Watergate to happen, the blurred lines between national security and political interest, the reliance on secrecy, the manipulation of public perception, still exist. They've changed form, but not function. We live in an age where private contractors handle national intelligence, where presidential candidates openly challenge the legitimacy of elections, where whistleblowers are charged under espionage laws, and where truth is not revealed but negotiated. The final lesson of Watergate, then, is not just that the system can be corrupted. It's that the system, if not constantly challenged, will corrupt. And perhaps that's the part they didn't want to tell you. Because it's not just about what one man did in the Oval Office. It's about what we're all willing to accept when power tells us once again to look the other way.